Heather, you and I have worked together and separately over the years as facilitators, as trainers, as mediators, and you and I know that when you're working with groups, there are times when you need to intervene because of an action, a behaviour or something that's said. And we all have our different ways of intervening in group situations. But having a framework, a route map, if you like, of different options is often useful because it, first of all, allows us to think about the range of interventions that there are and use those in appropriate circumstances and to be clear why we're using them. But the other reason is sometimes we all have preferences, I think, about which styles or which approaches we like. And that can be, bad habits can sneak in. So having a framework allows us to think more broadly about what ones we're using and which ones we probably need to use more. So that's the thing that the topic we're going to talk about today. And I guess what we're going to do is you're going to give us an overview of the framework and the 6 styles. Then we're then going to look at each style in some detail and give some examples of good use and perhaps inappropriate use of those styles. And then finally, a couple of top tips from both of us about the good use of those interventions during facilitation. So maybe do you want to kick us off then with giving us an overview of the framework?
Yes. Let me first of all tell you that this is based on some work that John Heron did in the later part of the 20th century. He developed it himself through, he's an academic, he developed it himself over the next 20 or so years, and it's now become a very sophisticated method of identifying how, when, why to work with groups in all kinds of contexts. We're going to take you back to the basic 6 styles that he started off with when he was working at the University of Surrey in the UK. And what this allows us to do is to have a really quite a simple way of identifying our own style currently and perhaps developing that so, as you say, James, to be broader and therefore to be more effective as a facilitator. And one thing that might be really useful to highlight at the very beginning of this is that what John Heron was talking about was whenever an individual, a facilitator, we're calling it in this context, is aiming to enable others and others to be more effective. So in any enabling context, and that might be learning, training, decision-making, problem-solving, and we'll come back to the idea of preferences in a moment. So first of all, let me just outline the 6 styles. And they're really divided into 2 groups. One, more directive, more from the perspective of the trainer or facilitator, and the other 3, somewhat less directive and more focused on the individual or the group. Now, all of them are enabling interventions. All of them are good. You mentioned us giving some examples later on, and we'll certainly do that. But just to begin by saying none of these are bad of themselves. And of course, always context, tone, pace, active listening, motivation, and impact, possible impact, all of those are relevant in those moments where those short moments where you're making a decision as a facilitator about what to say and for whose benefit. Again, some more things to say about that a bit later. So the 6 styles. Prescriptive, which all of this is jargon, and jargon is useful, but let me just add a word or 2 to explain that. So prescriptive intervention is one where the facilitator is telling the individual or the group. And that has some benefits, clarity and guidance. An informative intervention, so prescriptive, then informative, moving through this range that you were talking about, James. An informative intervention speaks for itself. It provides information, it provides data, provides an idea perhaps. A confrontative style is where you provide challenge, an opportunity, or even It might feel more demanding than that even, but an opportunity to reflect, to review, to rethink. And again, those three come from the perspective of the facilitator. And the next three are responding to the particular needs of the individual or the group. So we have a cathartic intervention, is one which just allows somebody to offload or the group to free themselves up, and we'll give examples of that later on. So cathartic is letting go so as then perhaps to be more responsive to what's happening in the learning activity or in the decision-making activity, whatever it is. The second intervention in this group of three is a catalytic intervention, which is perhaps the most jargon-ridden, but has a really important message. Creativity is vital to expanding ideas and possibilities. And so what a catalytic intervention does is to encourage creativity. And there are a range of ways in which you can do that and a range of times when that could be really useful to the group. And finally, a supportive intervention. Often when there is a need for an individual, or for the group even, to have some affirmation. So to provide some validity, some acknowledgement that what has been done has either been difficult or has been done in a way that has been demanding, very demanding sometimes, on the individual or the group. We've run through the 6 styles. Before we move on to looking at each of those in a little more detail with a couple of examples, let's just talk about preference. You talked about that earlier. If you fold your arms, James, at this point. Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to ask you to fold them the other way around. Okay. All right, so you could do it, but you had to think about it. Yeah, that's what a preference is. A little more difficult. Takes a little moment's more thought. That's your preference. And for each of us, what John Heron's initial work indicated that for each of us, perhaps two or three of these styles we prefer to the other 3 or 4. And therefore, we'll use them more often, and we may begin, as you were saying, to fall into the bad habit of using them in contexts where it's not appropriate. So we're looking at preferences, and the advantage of a very simple 6 styles model allows us to look quite simply at what we currently use and what we might add in to be more effective as a facilitator.
Great. So perhaps that being the overview, maybe we should look at each individual style in a little more detail, and think about give examples of a good use and maybe one where it may be less appropriate to use it. Yes. So shall I kick things off and start with the prescriptive intervention, or as you said, the tell, when the facilitator tells the participant what to do. And now generally in a facilitative type environment, this type of intervention you would probably use more sparingly, particularly when you're talking about the content of the work you're doing, or the learning output that you want, right? So it wouldn't normally be appropriate in this context to say to somebody, for example, I think that's not right, which is a very prescriptive intervention, or you need, this is the way, this is the right answer. In this context, there's probably a different way, another style you could use to achieve the same purpose. So don't use a prescriptive intervention in that way in a facilitative environment. When you might use prescriptive interventions in a facilitation is normally around, and often around process. So when you want the participants to do something in a process terms. So for example, what I'd like you to do first is to get together in groups of 4 and brainstorm different options. It's a prescription, I want you to do this, but it's about the process rather than the substantive output of the exercise. So that's an example of a good use of a prescriptive intervention.
So I'm going to move on to the informative intervention, which, as I said earlier, it speaks for itself. I'm not going to say very much about it. It's providing information, providing data, providing ideas, but in terms of content. And again, much more appropriate to be informative about process. So you might say, what we're going to do is to have a coffee break in 15 minutes. Now that might seem like a very simple intervention, but actually it's effective for more than one reason. It provides information, informative. It also might re-energize the group. It gives them a sense of how long they have to concentrate, which probably encourages a better participation for that 15 minutes.
You mentioned in process. On content, what I found in an informative intervention is to give an example of something you've seen in the past. So you might say, for example, in the past I've seen this work well, which is information rather than prescription.
Yes, that's a good example. So just one example then of an informative intervention which we would say is not effective, and I'll say why in a minute. So there isn't time to talk about that now. That's information, but it's not enabling. The idea of each of these interventions in the right context at the right time is that it enables the individual or the group.
So the next more directive intervention style is the confrontative intervention, which, by the way it sounds, is designed to be challenging or to give very direct feedback, right? Now again, you need to be very careful with this type of intervention, and tone and what you say and how you frame it is really important when you do this, just as a general comment. And you also need to be careful to do that when you do this in front of a group, or if you're singling out an individual, because it could undermine the individual or make them feel under pressure. So to give an example of an inappropriate use, it wouldn't be appropriate to use a confrontative intervention like this in front of the group. I see you're on the phone at the back there and you don't seem to be very engaged. Using that type of intervention to one individual or a table in front of the whole group would put them on the spot unnecessarily. Now it might be that you could say that in private, for example, but again, tone would be important there as a way of getting them to see their behaviour. And private use of confrontative interventions is often very useful. So for example, you might say in private to an individual, you saw how when you did this, how the group reacted negatively. Why do you think that was? Now that's giving direct feedback, it's putting them on the spot, done in a private way, but you're doing it for a purpose, to really get them to understand the impact of what they did.
And you might follow that up with another challenge with, so what might you do next time? So that's the three more direct interventions, all of which have their purpose, as we've seen. So let's move on to the other three, which are more by way of responding to the needs of an individual or perhaps the group. And the first of those is cathartic, and that really gives permission to an individual or to the group to offload, to breathe, yes, to free up, and therefore to be able to participate more effectively after the cathartic intervention and their response to that. So a couple of examples of that. Again, picking up your point about whether in public or in private, if there's an individual in the group who's been through an exercise, given some examples, for example, which have not been well received by the group, or indeed not really by the trainer either, if you were to say, tell us all what you're feeling at the moment, that's too exposing. Whereas that may be very appropriate in private.
Right. So it's the same intervention, but just different in private and in public.
Yes, and in front of a group, you may say to them, what would you like to say about that? Which gives permission and opportunity, but allows somebody to say, I don't really want to say anything at the moment. And that's fine too.
So the fifth style is the catalytic intervention, which is, as you say, quite a difficult jargony word, but it really means about sparking, allowing to spark, if you like, creativity in somebody to think about something differently, different alternatives, and to problem solve. Okay? So a good example, or two good examples of catalytic interventions would be to say to somebody, so how might you do that differently next time? Getting them to think through an alternative way of doing something when they've done something in the context of a facilitation. Another example is to say, so thinking about X, how might you do that in practice? You know, bringing the theory into real life and getting them to think through different options. Just watch out using catalytic interventions when you see somebody's really struggling. If they're struggling with something and maybe aren't able to engage in constructive problem solving or creative thinking, then probably avoid the use of a catalytic intervention, right?
And so finally, a supportive intervention. And I'm going to start with one which I often hear people using when they're trying to be empathetic and supportive, and it doesn't work. So let me give you this example. You're in a group, somebody's done something which has been quite tough to do, and perhaps they're not feeling entirely confident that it's gone well, and perhaps they look a little bit deflated or embarrassed, and you might say, yeah, I understand exactly what you're feeling. And that is an attempt to be empathetic, but it's not credible. Of course you don't understand exactly what they're feeling, and that's why it doesn't work. So let's do another one. You could simply say, so that was pretty tough. That's quite supportive. You might even be more specific than that if you can be, and you might say, that was a really brave question to ask the team. So James, a top tip each. Mine is to listen really carefully and attentively, to observe what's happening, and not to feel under huge pressure to respond immediately. A moment's pause will not be noticed by the group and will give you an opportunity really to choose an intervention that is going to be as effective as it can be in the context.
And my tip linked to that is, in that moment when you're pausing, thinking about what you're going to do, whatever you're going to do it with a purpose. And the purpose should be focused on to help the participant or the group in order to enable them, as you said earlier. It shouldn't be because you're feeling awkward or stuck. So really think about what you're trying to achieve and why, and do it from the perspective of the participant.
So we've looked at 6 interventions.
Yeah, gone through them all.
Gone through them all. We have our preferences. You and I, as well as others, the wider range of interventions we can use, the more effective we will be. So
yeah, I found having this framework just helps me be more conscious and think more actively about what I'm going to use when, and it's been a really useful tool for me over the years.
Good. So off we go.
Off we go, and feel free to use it.